The reason that we spend so much time on the news is to demonstrate that at the highest levels, Americans, as well as politicians around the world, have lost their ability to be rational and moral. And that far too many of the ordinary folk in countries throughout the West have also lost their ability to be rational and to be moral. If you're one of them, the topic during the second half of this program for the foreseeable future will be useless to you. We're going to use evidence and reason to prove beyond any doubt that the founder of the Christian religion, the author of half of the Christian New Testament, was a despicable liar. I'm not going to infer. I'm not going to speculate. I'm not going to slander. I'm going to tell you the truth. The only tools that I will wield in this campaign are evidence and reason. But if evidence and reason are things that you do not value, everything we talk about will be for naught. It will be wasted on you. Questioning Paul, the great Galatians debate. Is Christianity right or is it wrong? Chapter 1. Shaul. Question him. Are you aware that God himself asked you to question Paul? Most Christians believe that Paul, a Jewish rabbi born as Shaul, a man who wrote under the Latin pseudonym Paulos, and a Roman citizen, was the principal agent chosen by God to communicate the precepts of a religion they believe was founded by, I'll put this in quotes, Jesus Christ. A belief system predicated upon faith in the gospel of grace. This is surprising, since there is only one, albeit inaccurate, citation from, in quotes again, Jesus, and not a single statement from the Gospels in the corpus of Paul's 13 letters. In spite of this, or unaware of it, these same Christians believe that the lone self-proclaimed apostle, someone who never walked a step alongside Yahowah, which is the actual name of the individual errantly called Jesus, was authorized to denounce and discard God's Torah, to change his covenant, to dismiss his annual feasts, to reject his Shabbat, even to contradict Yahowah and his disciples. On the surface, this all seems preposterous. And yet, no matter how illogical this may be, it does not seem to matter to believers. I had not noticed, I don't know why, that the fact that Paul was a Roman citizen plays into this horrible tale that I am about to share with you. I knew that Paul was a rabbi, and we will speak at length about the rabbinic influence on Paul. And of course, it is clearly known that he was a citizen of the Roman Empire. But I had never drawn the conclusion until just now that that plays largely into this equation. I share that because in the book of Daniel, which means God judges and vindicates, known as Daniel, in the 7th and 8th chapters, Yahowah reveals a prophecy to Daniel that is the most sweeping in all of human history. It chronicles most all of human history. And in this prophecy, God begins by telling Daniel that the very country that was enslaving him, Babylon, Babylonia to be more exact, he was living in Babylon, the country was Babylonia, that it would succumb, and in the near future. And a country that he had never heard of, Persia, would come to conquer the Babylonians. And then they would spread their influence, but albeit in a different way, throughout the known world. He then speaks of how a Macedonian would conquer the Persians, and how the Macedonian Empire would be divided amongst Alexander's 4 generals. And this leads God to describe Rome. And in his depiction of Rome, he does say that Rome will be vicious, and that they will devour the empire that Alexander the Great had created. But God says there's something very different about the beast that is Rome. And that the beast that is Rome is despicable beyond imagination. And that the beast that is Rome doesn't end when the empire of Rome dies, but continues on. That Rome would continue to live through the myths it would promote, through Roman Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox religions. Myths that were originally conceived by Paul, a Roman citizen. Myths that were condoned and made the law of the land by Constantine, the founder, not only of the Roman Catholic Church, but also of the Eastern Orthodox Church. God describes the beast that ultimately grows out of the Roman Empire, known to Christians as the Antichrist, the Torahless one, or the transgressor to Yahowah, using terms that are identical to the character manifest in the Pauline letters. Now, while I recognize that Paul was not the Christian Antichrist, he is indistinguishable from him. And that his Roman attachment is all part of the scheme. It is from Rome that the beast seeks to rise above all things Yahowah. You may not know, but it is nonetheless true, that Hadrian came up with a brilliant plan, although diabolical, to lure the Jews that had been exiled from Israel during the initial Jewish-Roman war back into Jerusalem, back into the land, with promises of rebuilding their temple. And once lured back, he announced on that temple that he wasn't building the temple back as Yahowah's temple. No, he was building a temple to Jupiter, and that he was renaming the city after himself, pronouncing that he too would be renowned there as a god. That led to the next war between Rome and Judea. In that war, it was Hadrian's plan to eliminate Jews. He specifically banned the Torah, a book that Paul had annulled a number of years earlier. He banned circumcision. He either killed or enslaved every Jew, bar none. It was the most diabolical act ever perpetrated by Satan through a human or empire. It was Satan achieving what he had most wanted to achieve: pagan temples on top of the Temple Mount. No Jews in the Promised Land. The Jews, rather than being liberated, were enslaved. He was now honored by man as God in the greatest empire that man had ever seen. And it was based upon not just Hadrian as an egotistical warmonger. It was equally based on another Roman citizen, one who preceded him, by Paul. We have Glenn on the line, and before I proceed, I'd like to get Glenn's input. Welcome, Glenn. Oh.
Before you proceed, what?
I said, I'm open to your input before I proceed.
I see. Gotcha. Yeah, this is an interesting thing. I've not yet read Questioning Paul, so I'm going to derive a good bit of benefit from this. I originally called in today. I was waiting for IQ to finish, but at first just about what you were finishing up with him, just to say you were talking about the violence and the despicable nature of things going on. I always think of, like, as in the days of Noah, and then in the days of Noah, Genesis 6, the whole world was filled with violence. So yes. I guess we're, certainly get to see that increase, and we're seeing it today in Ukraine with the Ukrainian government military now killing off numbers of the pro-Russian forces. So just was going to say,
yes.
and the Russians have called for a Security Council. So,
to quote Yogi Berra, it's a deja vu all over again. The Babylonians were this way, as were the Persians, as were the Greeks, as were the Romans. In fact, God is so condemning of all things Rome, both its empire manifestation and its manifestation as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, that I decided that I would itemize all of Rome's wars. I am through 90% of them at this point, and I can tell you that what we have witnessed recently, no matter how barbaric, is being done in the name of Islam. Far worse was done in the name of the Roman gods. And I can tell you that as duplicitous as Americans seem to be today, they do not even rival the duplicitousness that was Rome then and now. We'll be back in a moment. The religious miracle, which makes the resulting religion popular, was performed in Shaul's, or if you prefer Paulos, or most Paul's, epistles to the Galatians, which serves as the blueprint of Pauline doctrine. In its pages, a stream of arguments are presented against the Torah and on behalf of faith. But is it realistic to believe that Paul could have annulled and discarded the Torah on God's authority, as he claims to have done? And if it was somehow possible that God's initial plan was ineffective, or worse, if it was an enslaving curse, as Paul claims it to be, what would make the replacement faith credible? What would make it even remotely believable? Therefore, the question before us is whether Christianity was established on the bedrock of divine revelation or on the shifting sands of one man's opinions. In the end, it all comes down to Galatians, Paul's first letter. As evidenced by the epistle itself, it is the first time where the Torah was assailed by someone claiming to speak for God. Without Galatians, there is no credible debate between observing the Torah, which is to examine its teaching, and faith, which is to believe in the unknown or uncertain. So while there are many critical passages in Paul's other letters, and most especially in Romans, Galatians provides the most methodical, approach to obfuscating God's previous testimony. Galatians is one of only two epistles, however, where the Shabbat and the feasts are placed in doubt, the other being Paul's letter to the Colossians. It is one of only two letters where a replacement covenant is presented, the other being in Paul's letter to the Romans. So without Galatians, there is no justification for rejecting anything Yahowah, which happens to be God's one and only name, shared with us. Galatians is the place where faith, which has become synonymous with religion, was first pitted against God's instructions. This was accomplished by Paul mischaracterizing the Torah's nature, inferring that to observe was to obey, and that to guide was to legislate. As a result, a book filled with Yahowah's teaching became synonymous with legalism. Wanting to be free to disregard the divine instructions, Shaul discredits and then discards the Torah in the 2nd and 3rd chapters of Galatians, so that in the 4th chapter he can position his advocacy for an entirely new and different covenant, with the one codified by Moses on Mount Sinai being called of the flesh, being framed as outdated and old-fashioned, as a means to enslavement, a way to condemn everyone. More than just being ground central for Christianity's disdain for all things Yahowah, his name, his word, his Torah, his covenant, his instructions, his Shabbat, his invitations to meet, his land, and his chosen people, in addition to his way, and even to his Messiah, Yahusha. Galatians pits Paul's new religion against most everything God has revealed. And in the epistle, the disciple Shimon, known to Christians as Peter, is mercilessly condemned by Paul. And Jacob, who has been corrupted to James, and Yochanan, known to Christians as John, are dismissed and they are demeaned. In this light, Galatians and the book of Acts present conflicting accounts of what's known as the Jerusalem Summit, further isolating Paul from Yahusha's disciples. Based upon its timing and content, it's obvious that Galatians was Paul's response, his rebuttal to having had his message censured, his authority questioned, and his reputation besmirched by Yahusha's disciples in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, for those who do not know, is from the verb that forms the basis of Torah, yara, and shalom, which means reconciliation. It is the source from which guidance regarding reconciliation flows. We will return to this presentation of Paul versus God after the commercial break. Paul's summation of the Jerusalem Summit sits in the midst of his epistle to the Galatians as to both issues which prompted the summit in the first place: the purpose of the Torah and the merits of circumcision. These themes dominate Galatians, with Paul's position constantly running in direct opposition to Yahowah, to Yahusha, to the disciples, and therefore to the Word of God. In due time, we will juxtapose these texts. So do not be concerned if you are currently unaware of this meeting, the Jerusalem Summit, or of the incompatible accounts of it that appear in Luke's letter called Acts and Paul's letter to the Galatians. Especially relevant to this discussion is Shimon's, which means he listens, but errantly called Peter's, overall evaluation of Paul, and especially his Galatians letter. That's found in 2 Shimon, 2 Peter. In the midst of bluntly criticizing their content and style, we are confronted with a statement which, at least when mistranslated and removed from its context, is often used to assert that Paul's epistles should be afforded scriptural status. But if this lone, dubious, and I'll put in quotes, endorsement falters, if it isn't credible in context, or if this isn't what Shimon actually wrote, then the idea of a New Testament comprised mostly of Paul's letters being considered scripture, in the sense of having been inspired by God, vanishes. Evidence for such a position would be regulated to the murk and myth, to the realm of human tradition, to faith and belief. As we dissect Shaul's overt condemnation of Shimon, as we will also study Shimon's direct and unabashed response to Shaul, doing both under a linguistic microscope, we will be able to determine whether the disciples' view of the self-proclaimed apostles' message and letters was to elevate it to scriptural status or to demean it as being confusing and wrong, even deceitful and deadly. Christian theologians, of course, unanimously side with Paul over Peter with regard to this great Galatians debate. In so doing, they have established their religion in opposition to Yahowah, in opposition to Yahusha, in opposition to Yahusha's disciples, and in opposition to the Word of God. In their view, Paul was right to associate the Torah with bondage, Yahweh's feast with Judaism, circumcision with the flesh, and God's conditions with legalism. For Christians, as a result of Paul announcing his new covenant theory in the 4th chapter of Galatians, it is appropriate to divide the Bible into 2 testaments, one old, the other new, one failed and counterproductive, with the other providing the hope of salvation by rejecting the old plan and placing one's faith in a new promise. For Christians, solely as a result of Paul's epistle, hell awaits anyone who clings to the past by observing the Torah, while heaven embraces all of those who put their faith in Paul's gospel of grace. With stakes this high, with the credibility of the religion of Christianity resting upon one man's letter, with the salvation of billions of souls at stake, few things could be as important as considering the possibility that Paul's epistle to the Galatians might not be trustworthy, especially if he openly contradicted the God he purported to represent. But if this world-renowned individual pulled off this feat, if he managed to supersede something as famous as the Torah, and if he supplanted it with something as nebulous as faith, and if he convinced the world that he had done so without contradicting God, even with God's blessing, Galatians would have to be the most brilliantly written thesis of all time. To determine if Shaul changed everything, including our understanding of God and his testimony, even the means to salvation, we're going to examine Paul's words under the lens of the world's most acclaimed lexicons, while referring to the oldest extant manuscripts, Paul's thoughts will be scrutinized by juxtaposing each proposal he makes against Yahowah's position on the same topic. We will leave nothing to chance or supposition. And while we are cognizant that billions of religious individuals believe that Galatians is Scripture, we will be honest, even if the result is judgmental and thus deemed offensive. Regardless of how many religious preconceptions succumb to the evidence, this pursuit of the truth will be relentlessly rational. We will go where the words lead. Are you willing to go there with us? For those who have not read the letter to the reader that begins this tome, then I would like you to know that at the outset of this study, I was inclined to think that Paul did no such thing. At the beginning of what would become an extraordinarily comprehensive evaluation of Paul's veracity, I was predisposed to believe that scribal error, misleading translations, unsupported interpretations, confusion over which nomos, the Greek word that is rendered law in Christian translations, which nomos Paul was assailing, and an overall ignorance of the Torah's purpose, that those things collectively had conspired to conceive religious teachings which were inconsistent with Paul's intended message. And yet it will be Shaul's words, not my preconceived notions, which will determine whether or not the most influential man in human history became such because he had the audacity to contradict God, the audacity to undermine his testimony, the audacity to establish a New Testament in place of the one he sought to annul. If he did, and if he made his case, then Christianity might be on solid footing. But if it wasn't appropriate to demean and dissolve the Torah, if faith isn't the answer, billions have been tragically misled, their souls extinguished as a consequence. As a result, it is instructive to reinforce the fact that Paul's given name was Shaul. It is of Hebrew origin, and it means he questions or question him, depending upon how the pronoun is accommodated. And questioning him as a result of what he questioned is precisely what we're going to do. In this vein, you should also know that the name Shaul is indistinguishable in Hebrew from Sheol, with Sheol meaning the grave, the pit, the realm of the dead. Also relevant, Shaul has become known as Paul only because he chose to speak and to write under the Latin name Paulos as a Roman. It means little and lowly in Latin, something which will loom large before we are finished. To arrive at the truth, we, like those who have gone before us, must resolve which nomos Paul was attacking, rabbinic law or Yahowah's Torah, which actually means teaching and guidance. We will have to closely compare the oldest textual witnesses to more modern Greek manuscripts to determine if Paul's words have been affected by scribal error, attributing things to Shaul that he did not actually say. After presenting Paul's letter in English, rendering it as accurately and completely as possible from the oldest manuscripts, we will have to compare our findings to other renderings to ascertain whether or not translational errors have artificially altered our impression of his purpose in writing this particular document. Fortunately, each of these questions can be emphatically resolved. One of the surprising obstacles that we will have to overcome along the way will become obvious in short order. Paul's letter to the Galatians is poorly written, reflecting the worst writing quality found anywhere in texts comprising the so-called Christian New Testament. We will encounter a steady diet of inappropriate words and worse. Many of Paul's sentences are flat out incomprehensible. The fact that the resulting literacy is well beneath the dignity of God is something that we will have to wrestle with, even though this doesn't seem to matter to a religion hell-bent on distancing itself from Yahowah, from his covenant, from his Torah, from his 4 statements that he etched in stone, or from 6 of his 7 feasts. Before we embark on this journey, there is something else that you should know. There are a handful of individuals who would like others to believe that Apollos didn't write Galatians. They use pedantic ploys to infer that this epistle, along with 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and both personal letters to Timothy, were foisted as a clever fraud and then later attributed to Paul. In support of this argument, there is phraseology that is prevalent in Galatians that appears less frequently in the subsequent epistles claimed by this man, perhaps the most influential individual in all of human history. We'll be back in a moment. In support of the obvious of Galatians being written by Paul, we must recognize that the book of Acts reveals that he had the kind of contentious relationship with the Galatians which is actually reflected in the epistle. We're told that the Galatians went from believing that Apollos was the incarnation of a Greek god to wanting to stone him for his caustic rhetoric. Second, Shimon, Peter, in his second epistle, evaluates an epistle Paul had written expressly to this particular audience, one that we learn from his greeting in 1 Peter has to be Galatia, because it is the only place where the addresses overlap. Therefore, based upon the disciples' letter, we know that Paul wrote an epistle to the Galatians, and if not this letter, then the authentic document has been lost. But more than that, the language Shimon, Peter, uses to describe Galatians is precisely consistent with the contents we find in the surviving copy. Third, the issues raised at the Jerusalem Summit serve as the centerpiece of this epistle. After reading Luke's, from the Latin Lucas's testimony in Acts, it becomes clear that the Galatians, that the book of Galatians, the letter to the Galatians, was Paul's response to his critics at this meeting. Status was paramount to Shaul, and therefore Galatians chronicles his desire to position himself as favorably as possible, especially vis-a-vis Yahushua's disciples, whom he routinely slights. Additionally, based upon the disparaging language, it appears that the letter was written immediately after that meeting, long before tempers cooled. And that means that Apollos would have had 12 subsequent opportunities to distance himself from the letter scribed to the Galatians had it been a fraud, because his open letters to the Thessalonians, Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians, as well as his personal notes to Timothy, Titus, and Philemon, all came later, as did most of his testimony in Acts. Never once is he heard denouncing the authenticity of his epistle to the Galatians, but is instead found building his case against the Torah and its covenant upon the very foundation he laid in Galatians. Fourth, Galatians is all about Shaul becoming Paulos, about his childhood, his religious education, his questionable call, his self-proclaimed mission, his adversarial preaching, his suspect credibility, and his personal trials and tribulations. Within its text, we find Paul referring to himself as the parent of his faithful children, as the perfect example to follow, as a person who can do no wrong, and as someone who cannot lie. So if Paul didn't write it, Galatians was either scribed by his publicist or by someone who spent the better part of their life polishing Paul's sandals. Fifth, the oldest extant copy of a codex containing Paul's epistles, it's called Papyrus 46, places Galatians in the midst of the other letters claimed by and attributed to Paulos. In order of their appearance in this ancient codex, these epistles include Romans, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, and 1st Thessalonians. And since P46 is dated between 85 and 125 CE, we know that one of the earliest collectors of Greek manuscripts believed that Paul penned this letter, as did Marcion in the 2nd century, a man who also will loom large in this saga. Sixth, Paulos had a propensity to sign his letters so that his audience would have some assurance that he was the author. With Galatians, he did much more than just sign his name. He personally attests to have written the conclusion with his own hand using what he calls really big letters. And seventh, Paul's signature term is cherish, the name of the Greek goddess of hospitality and merriment. Their name was transliterated into English as Grace, as a result of the Roman moniker for these same goddesses, the Gratia. We will consider Paul's use of grace when we continue with Shattering Myths after the news and commercial break.